see that artist there. So I just wanted to let you know about some of these programs coming up here within. So without further ado, I'll let Bob take over. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for coming out on this, at least the sun's shining on this weather day. Like all these talks that I do over the winter, they're all based on materials that are here in the archives. In some parts of what I'm going to talk about today, we have very extensive collections, and in others we have fairly small collections, but the collections are all here if you have any interest in going further on any of these topics. There are three realities about late 19th century Westfield. One, it was compact. That is, it was about a mile across from east to west and 3/4 of a mile north to south. The east to west boundaries of the community of Westfield were essentially Mill Street on the west and Little River on the east, the river on the north, and Silver Street on the south. Now, yes, there was a little community north of the river around the railroad station. But in essence, when you're talking about Westfield, in most of the 19th century, that's the compact area you're talking about. It's really very small. And it's very small for a good reason. If you're going to work, essentially, before automobiles and trains and all the rest, you've got to walk to work. So you're going to live within, at the most, a half, 3/4 of a mile of where you work. Population is concentrated. Second reality, Westfield is treeless. Now, we've got a hard time now with pollution and everything else keeping trees planted, but it's hard to understand that in most of the 19th century, there were no trees downtown Westfield. They'd all been cut because everybody burned wood and everybody built with wood and everybody did everything with wood. They cut every tree in sight. Third, Westfield was parkless. Now, you didn't need parks. What are parks for? Parks are for leisure and recreation. Westfield is so small that you can walk out your front door and within 15 or 20 minutes you're in a rural atmosphere. You don't need parks. You want to go fishing and swimming? You've got rivers to the north and south. You've got rivers internally. I mean, we've forgotten because we put the rivers underground, but as late as the Civil War, salmon were caught by the police department. And there was a major swimming hole on Franklin Street behind CVS. Every summer it was a huge swimming hole. There were skating rinks and swimming holes at the base of Noble Hospital Hill and on Pleasant Street. And of course the canal was open until the 1890s. In the winter it froze over. It was a great skating rink. You could skate for a mile or more up and down the canal. You didn't need parks. In 1869, Westfield celebrated its 200th anniversary. And there was suddenly civic consciousness. There was this sense, you know, we ought to be more than just a place to sleep and work. We ought to have a town that's booming. We ought to think positive about our town. And so in 1871, a group of concerned citizens created the Westfield Improvement Association. And they began to plant trees downtown. They created the green. Now, I know some of you have read some of the rather poorly written histories of the town that say that that was where the Revolutionary soldiers trained. No, it was a pond hole. It was a marshy, low spot in the center of ground. Now, that's not surprising, as I think I've told a number of you who've been to other talks. Downtown Westfield was a spruce swamp, which is why it wasn't settled until 150 years after the first settlers came here. first settlers came a half mile from where it is in the center of town, and they stayed there. They didn't come here until they could start to drain this downtown. So the 1871 committee began to fill in what will be the green, and they planted trees around it, and James Fowler, the godfather of this place, he put a fence around it, and he also paid to plant trees up and down Court Street. Some of you may have seen the late 19th century pictures of Court and Broad that have the elms just hanging over the street. They were planted at this time, consciously planted by James Fowler. A few years later, one of the members of that committee, he was one of the tree men in Westfield. The two most famous of them were Joseph Bartlett, who was a newspaper reporter, and Henry Holland, who was an eccentric druggist. His drugstore was right next to the library where M&T Bank is today. That was where his drugstore was. He was the only pharmacist in the famous Holland family that produced 12 doctors in the 19th century. But he was a little crazy. He loved trees. And he and Bartlett went around town recording the last remaining big trees in town. It's kind of interesting documents to see where the big trees were, and they measured them. Anyway, in 1871, he and a group of other like-minded citizens, they included Lockwood, the pastor of the First Church, Thayer of the famous Thayer family. There were brickmakers and contractors. Whitney, the attorney for the railroads. Greeno, who was the president of the normal school. So a group of your leading citizens, they got together and they created the Westfield Improvement Association, the Westfield Town Improvement Association, whose stated purpose in their contract, and we have the records of the association, was to buy land and create parks. But that's not what they did at first. They decided, particularly because the leader is Holland, Henry Holland, they're going to plant more trees. Now there's one part of the outskirts of town that has not been developed. If you go east, where you run into West Springfield and stuff, you've got hills and you've got buildings West Springfield this way. If you go south, you've got the farms of Southwick. If you go north, you've got farms and brush up there. The one area that's not been developed is the area to the west. As I said, housing and everything pretty much stopped at Mill Street. That's why the cemetery is up there. The cemetery was put, Pine Hill Cemetery was put on the outskirts of town. All there is from the cemetery west to Russell Mountain is a dirt track. Now, historically, it's known as the Knox Trail, and it really hasn't developed much since Henry Knox struggled down through that dirt trail with his cannon. If you wanted to go west, you went down to Route 20, and then up 23 or 20 and over the mountains that way. You didn't come down Western Avenue over Russell Mountain. You couldn't get over the mountain. What there was up there was scrub brushland beyond the cemetery and the remains of pine forest. Now, much of it had been cut down and it was second growth, but there were some sections of still old pines up there. That's why it's called Pine Hill. And what they decided to do was to develop that area. So they got rights away along the road, that dirt track. They widened it, they leveled it, they macadamized it. Now what that was is you got very fine stone and gravel and you pounded it into a fairly hard surface. When we think of macadam streets today, we think about adding tar to it. They didn't have tar then, but they had this pounded rock surface. They ditched the sides, and then they contracted the planting of 1,000 trees along the sides of that new road that they've created out to the west, out as far as Bates Road. They called it the Boulevard. Western Avenue's a new name. It was the Boulevard. They had some problems with local property owners who sued them because they had burned the brush off and set fire to some farmers' fences, and there was some controversy about it, but they have got themselves a fine highway extending from the end of the cemetery, about where the school is, out to about where Bates Road is. 1873, the nation goes into a major depression. This is the General Grant Depression, as people tended to corner the gold market. Their money dried up, and their improvements stopped. But they've got themselves a fine highway that goes to nowhere. Now, one of the members of the commission was Darwin Gillett. He and his son were businessmen in town. I've given talks on Gillett. These are not the Gilletts associated with this library. This is a different family entirely. If you want to know something about them, go down and look at the Westfield Gas and Light Department. Look up at the top of the building and you'll see D.L. Gillett, 1901. That was his dry goods store. The Gilletts were real estate entrepreneurs. They bought up property. They particularly bought it in the West. They owned thousands of acres in Iowa, Nebraska, Michigan, but they also bought properties all over Westfield. And here you've got this wonderful boulevard that doesn't really go anywhere. And think about it. Think in your mind, if you go up there, you go to the end of the cemetery, you go just a quarter of a mile further and you're on top of the hill. If you could stop, you can look and you can see a straight level line right straight through to Bates Road. In fact, the boulevard became a raceway for bright young bucks who got a new high-stepping horse that they want to try out. It became notorious for that. But it's straight, level, flat, and not heavily treated. So they begin to buy up property out along that line. Enter a new player, the Crane brothers. The Cranes have come to town and now have 2 paper mills. And to make sure those paper mills work, they build an estate just on Mill Street, where Genesis House is today. That's their estate. Now the Crane brothers had a passion, and the passion was trotting horses. They loved racehorses. So much that they built a private racetrack on their property. It would be behind Highland School. There was a private racetrack in there. And they built stables and training tracks for their horses in Wolf Pit Meadows. Somebody asked me the other day where Wolf Pit Meadows was. That's the flat land down on the river between the 2 mills. There used to be a road that ran all the way through there. I think that's closed off now. But that was Wolf Pit Meadows. That was where their stables were. And they had training tracks down there. They loved racetracks and horses. They joined with Ralph Gillett, the son in particular, and got the bright idea that what they would do is create a commercial racetrack pavilion. And in 1890, 3, they created the Waranoco Park Association. They built it on the land roughly across from the front of the college. Park Drive, Park Circle, Western Circle. That area there was where this racetrack and general amusement center was going to be. Now the problem is, it's almost 2 miles from the center of town. I mean, you can't have an entertainment venue without people being able to get there. So Ralph created a trolley line from the center of town out to that park. It was a horse-drawn trolley system. And he bought the town's bandstand. There was a bandstand on the green, a wooden bandstand for concerts. He bought it from the town and he moved it out there so they could have band concerts. The next year, to really make this thing work, he bought a part interest in the regular trolley line in downtown. He merged the 2 trolley lines. The downtown trolley line was electric, and so he's now got an electric trolley line. You can now run from the train station to the park. You can run from Springfield out to that park. He's now got a communications network that can bring customers to the park. And in 1895, the racing meet that summer was so successful, it drew 5,000 guests who paid a nickel a ride on the trolley line to go out there and enjoy the cool airs. By the way, I worked at the college for 30 years, and one of the things I noticed is the weather is slightly different up there than it is in downtown Westfield. Sometimes you will have a little light snow up there and you don't get it down here. It's also just enough difference in elevation. It is cooler up there, just a little bit. So here was the summer event, wonderfully successful. So successful, in fact, that an Italian immigrant in town, Joe Gianoso, who had a fruit and vegetable stand in town, he decided to take advantage of the park, and directly across from the park, about where Scanlon Hall is on the college campus, he erected a picnic pavilion where you could pay and have your family association or your church picnics. He's going to take advantage of this trolley line and all the rest. Everything is going wonderfully. That is until 1907, when fire breaks out and it burns down there were about 75 or 80 stables for the horses for the racetracks. Well, they've got to recover from that, and they had a hard time doing it. The association went bankrupt. Now, remember, the events are really only taking place during these race meets in the summer. So the rest of the year, the place is vacant up there. But Crane and Ralph Gillett buy out the other partners and decide they're going to start over again. This time, they build sheds for 150 horses. Now, that's what the records say. I can't visualize that. I'm not sure I believe it, but supposedly covered horse barns that would hold 150 horses for race meets. Problem was, Ralph Gillett dies in 1910. They struggle for a couple of more years. There's fire again. The stadium burns down. More of the horse stables burn down. Now remember, there's no electricity up there, and there's nobody up there for 9 months of the year. So quite clearly, these are set fires. These are vandalism fires. They burned the stadium down. In 1913, they're determined to keep investing money in it, and they build a big metal stadium, a concrete and metal stadium. They build a big new pavilion, and that's what most of these pictures over here are. This is the finished stadium. Here's a later built of it. This is the steel and concrete stadium they put up. And oh, by the way, another part of going to this park, you could, on a warm Sunday afternoon, decide, does that thing stop picking? You could decide to go for a carriage ride, and you could go up and go on Western Circle Drive. Now, if you go on Western Circle today, you go around the end and it drops down into a hollow. That's where this was. And I'm told by the Stanley Park employees who own the back end of that, that is still out there. This was a natural spring that you could go and collect fresh water, because the drinking water in downtown Westfield was considered bad throughout this era. So you could go up there and get this nice crystal spring drinking water. Between 1913 and 1917 was the boom year for this park. Horse races, vaudeville shows, concerts, baseball games, school picnics. We've got programs. They had elementary school field days up there where they had races, and second and third graders ran races and got prizes. It was a big social place in Westfield. There was an underlying problem, though, and the problem appears in the newspaper stories. Apparently there was a big problem with gambling on the horse races, and when you've got gamblers and horse races, you've got an enormous problem of races being fixed. And there was intervention from the state a number of times. There were outcries about fixed races. There was a lot of controversy about what was going on. And then, of course, remember the dates I'm giving you, World War I breaks out. And by 1917, the United States is involved in the war, and that pretty much shuts down any activities up there. When the war is over with, they stumble through a couple of activities. It doesn't work. And by 1921, the park is bankrupt again. Shuts down. 1933, the few desperate individuals who are horsey people in the neighborhood really want to get horse racing started again. In the summer of 1933, they opened for a series of races and then shut down immediately thereafter, never to open again. In 1946, the derelict remains are bulldozed. In 1952, Westfield has one of the most disastrous fires it's ever had, the professional building fire. And there was a professional building was 5 stories and burned, and a couple of buildings around it burned, and all that rubble had to go somewhere. They trucked it up there and dumped it in the various ponds and low-level areas that were up there. I've had various people over the years who have bought property in that area say, you know, I was digging in my yard and I found this piece of masonry. A couple of people had sculpted peoples that they found in their yards. But that was filled up there, and then they began to build houses on it. This park wasn't the only thing for entertainment that had been developed along this boulevard. Now, Ralph Gillette, remember I told you he bought all the property. Ralph had been trying to sell building lots throughout this period of time. And he forms the Toccoa Park Realty, or Toccoa Overlook Realty Association to sell building lots. I don't know, does anybody here live on Toccoa Overlook? I think you know where the street is. If you look at right from the end of the cemetery out to Lloyd's Hill, on the right-hand side, all those big houses were built on Ralph Gillett's lots from 1893 until roughly his death in 1910. That's how that development took place. As I said, the park wasn't the only leisure thing was going on, because Ralph Gillett not only liked horse racing, he liked golf. And in the late 1890s, Americans discovered golf. Suddenly, golf courses are popping up all over America. It is the leisure activity for the well-to-do. That's what Ralph is trying to persuade to come up on Western Avenue. So you obviously want a golf course to encourage them to buy lots to build one of those big houses. In 1899, he, the Cranes, and a few other of the same leading families create the Toccoa Golf Club. And Ralph donates a piece of land for the course. Now, I have not been able to nail down what the piece of land was, but I believe it is the area that is the open field for Stanley Park with the stone fence around it. I believe that's where it was. It was, depending on what newspaper article I'm reading, 3-hole, 6-hole, or 9-hole. It had a small clubhouse of some kind, but it was a very temporary sort of a thing. The golf course was a little different from most golf courses because it was co-ed, and it allowed young people to be members too. And it functioned. I can't tell you much more about that. From 1899 to 1910. But in 1910, Ralph Gillett turned to the other members of the club and said, I want my land back. I've been able to sell these lots up to Lloyd's Hill. Now I'm going to sell lots the rest of the way. And I don't want a golf course out there. That forced the other members to buy him out and to buy from him a little piece of property on the right-hand or northern side of Western Avenue, which is where the Stanley Home Products corporate headquarters was / college offices today. And they built a clubhouse on that bluff. Now, they didn't have land for a course. They had to get new land for a course. So what they did is they went down the bluff and bought a piece of land on the south side of Route 20. Now, if you go out Westfield today and you go past the Lloyd's Hill Road, it's sort of brush in there. There isn't much of anything along there. But if you come up and look closely, they cut a path from the top of the hill down that bluff. I'm told by people who wander in the woods around here that you can still find the remains of that path. And they made 3 holes along that south side. You can see there are ponds in there too that have been filled in since then. A few years later, they bought a small piece of land on the other side of Route 20 and put 6 more holes there. So they're a 9-hole golf club. We have all their records for the 1920s. So So in that period, we can get a wonderful look at what they're doing. They had a big membership, 400 or 500 members. However, the members weren't paying their dues, and they're constantly dunning people for their dues. The club was always shaky. It comes close to disaster year after year, complicated by the fact that most of their holes for the course are in the floodplain for the Westfield River. And in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, before they built the dams up here, upriver, every couple of years, the area that is today Toccoa Golf Club was underwater, at least for a period of the year. They constantly are struggling with disaster. Finally, in 1961, they get taken over by Fred Parker from U.S. Whip, who is a millionaire. Or he has taken over the club a few years earlier. He has kept its finances, and he's provided the money for them to buy an 18-hole course down on Route 20, which will become the Toccoa Golf Course that we know today. Remember I told you Ralph Gillett was going to develop all that land out there? That's why he wanted his land back. He died. He never got a chance to develop it. His sons took a large piece of that land and created a commercial dairy. Ralph died in 1913. By 1915, 2 years later, Waranoco Farms was in existence. It is, of course, the offices and the machinery buildings for Stanley Park today. You all know it's those white buildings back there. The farm was that great open field in the front, and this was a commercial dairy. It stumbled for years. Ralph died fairly young. His sons died fairly young. And the farm fell into the hands of a different manager every couple of years. It's in and out of business. If you look at the city directors, you'll see there are different managers about every year trying to run the place. And then the Depression hits. And the Depression wiped it out. They went bankrupt in 1933 and they just shut the operation down. Ultimately, that property was bought by Fred Parker, one of the few people in town who had money. So he's bought that, and he's bought the golf course across the road. And there it sits. Enter the next player, Frank Stanley Beveridge. Born in 1879, died in 1956. I mean, he's a man that the name everybody knows, but you realize he died 75 years ago? You know. Born in Nova Scotia, comes to the Massachusetts for education at Mount Hermon Academy, earns his tuition and board by working on farms in the area and by being a door-to-door salesman. And he's very good at it. When he finishes his education, he becomes employed by the Fuller Brush Company for his salesman skills and works his way up. I didn't realize until I began putting this together that Fuller Brush Company was headquartered in Hartford. I didn't realize. Never knew where it was. I never thought about it. But anyway, he ends up the vice president for sales for Fuller Brush. In 1929, He is 50 years old. Now, in none of the records of Frank Sandy Beveridge is there an explanation for what happens. There is no explanation. He is vice president for sales, and then he no longer works for the Fuller Brush Company. Over the next 2 years, he's in and out of various other companies in sales. And in 1931, in the summer of 1931, he ends up in a small shed on Burge Avenue in Westfield. Burge Avenue was a little tiny street behind St. Mary's High School. I know the legends of Westfield as well as I think all of you do. He comes to Westfield for some reason, is so enamored of the flower boxes on the bridge, he loves Westfield, and the rest is history. It's one of the Westfield legends. There's nothing in the records that suggests anything about that. Anyway, he's here in Westfield. It is the Depression. It's 1931. And he decides to replicate the Fuller Brush Company. That's what he knows. That's what he's done for years. But he's going to do it with a difference, and it's the difference that makes the corporation. Now, the Fuller Brush Company and dozens, hundreds of other companies in America in the 19th and early 20th century hired salesmen to go out and beat the bushes, go door to door and sell their wares. When I was growing up, the Watkins man and the Raleigh man and the Electrolux man and the Fuller Brush man, they all came to the door. It was a hard way to make a living. These people all worked on commissions, terribly hard way to do it. Now, the Fuller Brush products were a little different because unlike some of the companies, the products were things you could use. The things that you would buy in time. They were household products. The difference that he did is in the Depression, there were all kinds of people desperate to raise money anyway, and you had hundreds of men out there beating on doors trying to sell things. He went to an untapped resource. The resource was housewives. Now, there's a long American tradition of butter and egg money for housewives. Women who are stuck in the home, some little way they can get some spending money. They don't have to get enough money to make a living on it, but it gives them some money. So what he did is he said, I'm going to concentrate on the housewives, and they will sell to their friends and neighbors. They won't be this hostile stranger banging on a door. They'll be people you know, people you like, people you want to help, and they're not trying to live off this. They're just trying to make a little extra money, so they'll do that. Well, that was a good idea. But in order for this to grow, you've got to be much bigger than that. You've got to think much bigger. And so he created, as far as I know, the first pyramid scheme. The idea is that you get one of these housewives who's really good at it and persuade her to get a half dozen other housewives, and she'll supply them with product. You give her a commission on everybody she gets. Pyramid scheme. Now, the only way this is really going to work, particularly in the depths of depression, is if everybody's enthusiastic. And so, he knows that it is crucial to build the morale of those doing the selling. That is absolutely essential. And so, he creates all kinds of promotions and incentives to convince the sellers that they are doing God's work. I'm putting it in modern terms, but that's the idea, that this is a great thing you're doing. I mean, they have exercise manuals, they have song sheets, they have newsletters, they have all kinds of things. The corporation grows. He knows that the best way of building this morale is if he can bring these people together in one room and have a booster session with them. Really get them to see other people and let them feed off the energies of each other. In the 1930s, Westfield is not an attractive place to have booster meetings. Now, think about it now. We don't have we didn't then, we don't today, have big fancy hotels. We didn't have large meeting rooms. We didn't have entertainment districts. What we had was a communications network. You could get to Westfield, but what were you going to do when you got here? And particularly in the pre-air-conditioned days, you're going to bring people together in the summer. Summer in downtown Westfield in the 1930s is damned uncomfortable. So he's got this problem. How is he going to solve it? In 1942, he's been successful enough, he's got enough money, the business is growing, he knows where he wants to go, he knows what he wants to do, and so he buys, depending on the record you read, 38, 40, or 42 acres of land off Western Avenue. Most of it has a pine forest on it. It is, as I've already said, a little cooler up there, particularly under the pine trees. It's more comfortable. And he has this vision of somehow using this property for his conference center. 1942, we're up to our armpits in World War II. Nothing's going to happen now. What he does do is the front piece of the property, as best as I can work it, it's probably the area for the dancing fountain out in front of the Rose Garden where they park up there. It's probably that area. He sets aside 12 acres for Victory Gardens. Victory Gardens in World War II were a very big thing, a very big promotional thing. And he sets aside 12 acres there for Victory Gardens for his employees. And to keep his employees happy, at the end of the harvest, he has a harvest fair each year. So the employees can exhibit the best produce and they can get, it's like a country fair. By 1945, the employees are now exhibiting their crafts, and the women are bringing in their sewing, and there's entertainment. You've got quite a country fair atmosphere going on. Again, it's morale builder for the employees. 1946, the war is over with. Frank Stanley Beveridge is, I think, 70 now. 70 in the 1940s is probably the late 80s equivalent today. Frank Stanley Beveridge is quite aware that the end is in front of him and he hasn't really done what he wanted to do. So between 1946 and 1950, he makes a number of startling moves. At least startling as far as the general public and the headlines in the newspaper. One, he moves all his manufacturing entities out of Westfield. And he moves them to East Hampton because they had abandoned factories and gave him a better deal than the Westfield people. He moves on everything up there. He incorporates and issues stock Now, prior to this, he had created dividends from the profits each year and gave dividends to his employees. It was one of the reasons his employees were very, very loyal to him. Now he issues stock to the public. 3, he expands his operations into Canada, into Mexico, to California, and the West Coast. 4, he begins national advertising. He had never done national advertising before this. So in that 4 years, he takes what was, in essence, a local successful business and creates a modern international corporation. And he turns back to that 40 acres he's got, and he decides he is going to create that conference center. He lays plans to put in cabins and a pavilion. He hires a specialist out of New York City to create a Chautauqua-like program. Now, if you're not familiar, Chautauqua was a 19th century program in Western New York, originated in Western New York State, where, I think it was the Methodist Church created it, where you could go in the summer for a summer vacation in the cabins, and you got uplifting and enlightening lectures and music programs and the rest. And then Chautauqua speakers began to travel around the United States. He brought in one of those experts to help him create programs for this conference center. And he hired Frank Pack. Frank Pack was to be his gardener. And Frank Pack is to take this plowed up 12 acres in the front and this pine forest in the back and create a garden. Now, he didn't really provide any money for Frank Pack to do that, but he tied it into his promotional networks for the salesmen, because it became a goal for salesmen. Groups of salesmen were to provide the money and resources to develop everything. The Texans, for instance, created the Rose Gardens. Another state created the walks. Ultimately, a few years later, the Canadians would create the Carillon Tower. The Mexicans would create the Angel of Mercy in that park in the back. So he got various groups of employees to provide the resources under Frank Pack's direction to create a park. All of the publicity about this goes into his national publicity. So he's nationwide saying, look at this wonderful thing we're doing for our employees. Now, I'm emphasizing that because I think people in Westfield believe that Frank Stanley Beveridge created a park for the people of Westfield. He did not. This was a corporate headquarters. In 1948, he went one step further, and this got national publicity. The first wedding in the park for 2 of the Stanley Corporation employees. And it got headlines across the nation and pictures of the wedding beginning what would become a tradition up there. Now, the park was open on occasion, on special events to the public. But it was not open in the sense that it is today. It was still very much a corporate piece of property. So here we are, 1948. The corporate park is beginning to grow, beginning to develop. The golf course across the street is, for all practical purposes, defunct. The Waranoco Farms next door is in the estate of Frederick Parker. It's been bankrupt and deserted since the 1930s. Down the road, Waranoco Park is just in the process of being bulldozed. On the other side of the road is an area known as Juniper Park. That had been land that belonged to the city, and it was tied into the Poor Farm, which was down the hill below it. What it had been used for was for an isolation ward for anybody who was in the Poor Farm who had a contagious disease. And in fact, in the 1960s, when the college was beginning the building of Dickinson Hall, they dug up graves that were from that isolation ward. So that's a city defunct land. So everything's defunct all the way along. But it's 1948. Westfield has come out of the Depression, has come out of World War II. Westfield is beginning to boom and expand and think about growth. There's all that empty land up there. There are various plans. Pine Hill Cemetery Association is getting filled up, and they announced they're thinking about buying that land for an expansion of the cemetery. Well, that creates outrage everywhere. Then there's talk that the baby boom has started. We're going to need new schools. That we need a new elementary school on that side of the city, and we'll put an elementary school up there. The bigger plan was for a new high school. I came to town in 1966, and there was debate about a new high school every year, year after year after year after year. I don't know, they finally built it somewhere in the mid-70s, something like that. But they were going to put a new high school out there. And then rumors began to float that maybe the state wanted a new campus for the normal school. And that would be a great place for it. In 1951, Frank Stanley Beveridge makes another one of those surprise moves. Two announcements appear in the paper. The corporate park headquarters is split off from the corporation, and it becomes the Stanley Park Corporation. It's a separate entity. And two, he purchases the Waranoco Farms property and across the road, the old golf course, of the old golf club. Now, it's not absolutely clear what he's going to do with it. And nothing really is done with it until after he dies. He dies in 56. By that point in time, from 1953 to 1956, in colloquial terms, all hell breaks loose on Western Avenue. Housing developments, the college moves out, housing developments spring up everywhere, and suddenly this is the last big piece of property left in town that can be developed, and everybody goes for it in these boom years of the early 50s. That boom development there continues through the 60s. We have the Western Avenue we know today. The important point that I would like you to take away from this is that you see out Western Avenue from the cemetery out is fairly new in terms of the history of Westfield. The section from the end of the cemetery to Lloyd's Hill was built 110 years ago. And in fact, it's only the right-hand side, the north side of Western Avenue was built. If you drive out Western Avenue and look, on the north side, you've got those big 3-story houses. On the south side, you've got 1940s houses, 30s, 40s, and 50s houses. So it was only the one side that was developed. And then from Lloyd's Hill on out, that is a product of the last 50 years. It's all fairly new in terms of the history of Westfield. And this is largely forgotten. Now, there's just one of these pictures that I want to bring to your attention because it doesn't belong to this talk, but it belongs to a problem with our archives. And maybe somebody here can ultimately help me figure it out. We have a fairly large collection of photographs of the Toccoa Golf Course. Most of them are of this type. Large groups of men, often with beer mugs in their hands, gathered in front of the club. While I was preparing this, I don't know, for some reason I stopped and really took a look at the picture and discovered that, I mean, the two look somewhat alike, but if you look closely, you see they're not the same building. And written across the top here, doesn't say Toccoa Golf Club. It says Westfield Golf Club. And my first response was, well, the club went in and out of bankruptcy a number of times, probably they changed the name. And then I found a couple of newspaper articles from 1905 to 1910 talking about the gathering of men at the Westfield Country Club for lamb roasts and steak roasts on the Little River. And I can't find out anything else about it. But most of our photographs that are in the file that says Toccoa Golf Club are not of the Toccoa Golf Club. They are of this Westfield Country Club. And I don't have any idea what it was or where it was, and I, so far, haven't been able to find out anything about it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
There was still activity at the Orinoco Park in the 40s, because I went to a horse race there. Off and on, I guess it was.
Yeah.
It was part of the Toccoa Park, the golf area. It was a brick building, and part of that, the silhouette, what was left from a fire. I can remember when I was a kid in the early 60s.
Yeah, except this was on the
Right,
river.
you said that, but whatever the structure was that was there, if you were coming down Western Avenue or heading toward the college on the right, there was a silhouette of that. It was a brick building, and it's where the original Toccoa golf course was. And that was, I'm gonna say that was 61, 62, somewhere in there. And at some point it was raised, but it was just, it must have been a pretty good fire in there. And I remember you could see the chimney from it and whatever was left of the brick part of it, but not necessarily that one, I believe is Western, or Little River. But whatever that building was on Western Ave, I can remember as a kid being there.
That was the original country club. That
Right.
building, it was a wooden structure, and it should have brick in it. And you had two holes up above, first hole, second hole. And then you would tee off that.
Went down that hill.
Down the hill, and you your third hole was there, and then you chip over to the fourth one, and then you would go across the street. A guy by the name of Marge, who was the grower,
Yeah.
down.
Yes?
In the Fuller Brush Company, once it went international, did they change their employee structure of being women, or did that just change to, like, at that time it was whoever wanted to?
What I can gather from the documents I have at hand is that the initial sales were largely women out of their home to their neighbors. But above them were a layer of mostly males, who, it's a pyramid,
Okay.
pyramiding off. At least that's what I gather from, we have some copies of the newsletter, and then of course we have the newspaper clippings. So, but what I can read in the newsletter, that's the way it seems to be structured.
Like, what kind of products?
Oh, it was household products, and they were very good products. Very, very well known, very well respected products.
They sold it in the parking lot. Your mother would invite 15, 20 people over, and they would show all the products.
Yeah, I know where it's
Bring
housed.
it out in a case, put it out on the table, and say, here's this, here's that, and then they were like quarters.
Who was that house? Oh, okay. Yes,
How is Stanley Park open to the public?
pardon?
Stanley Park open to the public?
When it really becomes the kind of park that we're familiar with today is really after 1956. I've forgotten the name of the director who was for a very long time director up there in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Tower,
Pardon?
one of them was Mr. Tower.
Yeah?
When we lived back at the park.
Yeah, but the president of the Stanley Park Corporation was also an officer in Stanley Corporation. Probably was Tower. But anyway, it was at that time that you really get, first of all, the ravine where you got the bridge and the duck ponds. That was part of the Warren-Oakville Farms. That was not part of Stanley Park until this purchase. So it's under the second man that you get all that development that takes place. And you get the real sense that this is a privately owned but public park. All I'm trying to emphasize with that was not the goal of Frank Stanley Beveridge. He begins to drift that way his last few years, but that was not what he had in mind. I think there's this sense I mentioned before that he came to town and so loved the town that he built the park. That wasn't what he did, and it wasn't what he had in mind. Yes?
When does the mills close in East Hampton, and where does the manufacturing continue?
Well, first of all, they stopped doing that. I've forgotten the years. They all kind of blended to me, and I wasn't paying that much attention. It was the Mexican side that took over the corporation, and they became gifts, these ceramic deedoos and gigas that you get. They stopped doing the household stuff sometime in the 70s. I think it was in the 70s. They became a different kind of a corporation, and that was shortly after they moved out of town.
Did the marble quarries have anything to do with what's happening to them?
No, because they were at the far end, and by the 30s, they were bankrupt too. They were all done too. The bulk of the last of their stuff came out, 38, 39 in Rockefeller Center. They went back and got some marble out then. But I don't think they ever reopened after that. And they were never a big enough operation to make much difference. You really think about them being almost in Russell up there. They're just that far out.
My grandfather's working in marble quarries.
Yeah,
In 1930.
that's one of
He
the,
bought land in 1930 when it was announced, and he worked in the
Liptech? Is it Liptech? Alexec, yeah, because the Lexecs and the Liptechs and others were the big workers up there, yeah. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.